tells us two other stories, two other parables that we have to connect, to put together. It's like a trilogy in the movies. So we struggle to understand the third movie if we haven't watched the first two ones. So it's exactly that's the idea. So that's the context. So in one of them, there's a woman who loses a silver coin. However, what does she do? She lights a lamp and seeks diligently until she finds it. And after finding it, she calls together the friends, the neighbors, rejoices and celebrates. So reading with our 21st century eyes, modern eyes, it sounds a bit simplistic, doesn't it? It's like someone in the church lose the wedding ring and put the house upside down until finds, wow, I found it. Call Pastor Vitali, Pastor, please, I want to have a special service and I want to celebrate with my brothers and sisters in the church because I lost my ring and I found it. So we need to understand the culture. We need to understand clearly the context. And that's why it's so important to understand the original context and who are the people Jesus is addressing. So when we talk about the main figure, the character of the parable was a woman, a common woman. So when we talk about a common woman of that time, and if we look at the social role a woman had in the Palestine in the first century, we would notice immediately it was minimal. Women could not work outside the domestic environment. They exceptionally would have a distinct profession, a public profession. So everything was pretty much limited and was profoundly dependent on their husbands or male relatives. So by the way, what age do you think was the typical age a woman would marry in those days? 14 years old. So when she was, after the first menstrual cycle, she was considered suitable for wedding, for the marriage. So therefore, after getting married, it was the husband, the person who looked after her. In case her husband died, she had essentially three options. Option number one, which is the most popular, thanks God for that, she would have to return to her original community, to the family community, where the parents, the relatives, and the friends would find someone, typically a relative rescuer, that would remarry her. Second option would become a beggar, and the third option would prostitute herself. So see the limitations and the significant restrictions that what would be a woman there. And a very important thing is the centrality of the wedding. It's a very, very importantly central relevance in the woman's life in those days. And a very important thing happened then. Essentially, the groom would pay the father of his future wife the endowment, the dowry. And by the way, it's still done in many parts of the world today. In the Middle East, if you go today to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Egypt, you will find a lot of communities that still pay. You have to pay $5,000 to $10,000 to the father. And coming back to the context, the father would take a significant portion of that money and would give back, well, okay, to his daughter. And that money was essential for her. That would be the means that she could use in an emergency situation. So that money could be a matter of life or death. If you go to the Google and do a Google search and put Bedouin women and look at images, you'll see the figures of some women that would be dressed typically in the typical dressing, especially the wedding dressing, which is the most special type of dressing code they have. And there are a lot of coins around the neck, the necklace pattern. So these are the coins that Jesus is talking about. They're so important, so central for them. To lose one single coin, it would be for us like someone losing their passport in a wartime. It's like selling your car and losing the buying check. It's extremely important. So that's, when we look at the Bible, you see the Old Testament, you see situations like Naomi and Ruth. They used that money to be able to go back to Bethlehem. So that's a very, very important thing. So now we start to understand why the woman was so happy for having found her precious lost coin. To lose one of those coins is comparable to what I just mentioned, and when Jesus' listeners understood clearly that. And the first impression, the message that Jesus is saying, well, the Father figure, God, is the one who seeks you, and you're lost. Then he tells another story. Jesus continues with the second story about a lost sheep. Palestinian shepherds, in those days, they had a very typical routine, a very typical itinerary. They spent the day between two places, the pen, the sheepfold, and the oasis. So every single day, a daily routine, they would leave the pen, cross the desert, go to the oasis with conducting the sheep, and the sheep could have the water, could be fed with the grass, and then come back. Approximately 3 to 4 kilometers apart. Daily routine, back and forth, back and forth. So in one day, the story says, One sheep was lost, went astray, and the shepherd left the other 99 sheep at the pen in a safe place and went out for the rescue of this only one. So very interesting why Jesus is making all the stories before going to do what seems to be the main element of the narrative, which is the prodigal son parable. So why does he do that? So you need to go back. Please open your Bible. Keep your Bible open on the chapter 15 of the Gospel of Luke. So when we read verse 1 and 2, we'll see what is written there. The tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So when we read this, so we see that Jesus is having a meal, but he's having a meal with people of bad reputation. But where was Jesus eating with those sinners? In those days, there were no restaurants, at least as we understand them today. So Jesus was having a meal, is eating in someone's house. And that's exactly the problem. To eat in someone's company was a sign of profound identification, of profound empathy, of friendship with someone. And that's precisely the problem, because according to the Pharisees, this is the kind of people, sinners, tax collectors, the low sort of caste of the society and horrible reputation. And according to the Pharisees, this is the kind of people you should never waste your time with, let alone showing this sign, public sign of fellowship and friendship. So they look at Jesus and say, what? Is this the guy people are saying is the Messiah? Is the sort of special rabbi that teaches, operate miracles and do a lot of stuff? It's a horrible reference, it's a horrible example. Doing this with this kind of people, how come? It's completely unacceptable, and they behave in a furious manner. So when we have to visualize the scene. We have to think Jesus inside of a house, having a meal, in moments of intimacy, of fellowship, having fun, and the Pharisees outside. They start complaining, groaning, audibly, to the point that Jesus listens to that, come out of the house, and approach them. So when they start complaining to Jesus, Jesus comes to them and says, "Can I tell you 3 stories?" He says, "Yes, you can." And then he starts the process. The first 2 stories just talked about, and then comes to the most important part. So Jesus tells that. The first part of the story, as we see here, chapter 15, it starts with a conversation. So essentially, what we see is a younger son approaching his father saying, "Father, give me the share of the estate that corresponds to me." But now, for us, these words, although they may sound a little bit strange, but it's possible. We have some much more weird situations. We have parental divorce. We have intergenerational divorce. So how come to demand part of my inheritance right now would be an issue? But for those days, it was absolutely unacceptable. Absolutely unheard of. For a Palestinian patriarch, they would sound profoundly, deeply offensive and completely unacceptable. Even today, for the Middle Eastern father, those words could sound the deepest insult that he could hear. He's wishing to have you, if you were a father, only after your death, your patrimony would be shared among your children. So that's a situation that what he's actually saying, the message is, to wish such a thing is to wish his father dead. So the younger son clearly wants the father's things, the father's patrimony, but not the father. He wants the father's wealth, the father's comfort, the prestige, the money, and everything you can obtain with those things. But he doesn't want the father. The father is just a mean for his end. So let's go be objective. Let's go straight to the point. I want what I deserve, what I have to inherit, and give it me now. I'm young and the longevity was not like nowadays. I have time in life to spend the way I want, and I want it now. And that's completely strange. Very, very strange. So the language and the message Jesus conveys is a very, very weird message for them, a very unusual for them, a very shocking type of narrative. And the interesting thing is, it would be expected from a father from that time to drive the boy out of the house with verbal and even physical violence. That would be the expected reaction. That's exactly what he does not do. The Bible says exactly the opposite. He does that. He does as the Son wishes. And the interesting thing here is that the word used in Greek for patrimony, for state, is the word bios, which means life. Is the word, what we use in words derivative from the Latin that we use in English, like biology, biosphere, means life. So why does he use that? When we think about life there, first, there were no banks as we understand today. So to give the Son the share, the portion that corresponded to him, he would have to sell the land. And the identity of patriarchs in those days were very, very linked, very connected to the notion of land. The more land you had, the higher would be your reputation. So literally bios means that he had to get rid of a part of his own reputation, his own life. His reputation, his identity, his prestige before the community, you have to diminish to conceive what he wanted, what his Son wanted. And that's exactly what he does. And another very important aspect is that in the division of the inheritance, always the eldest brother would receive twice as much, a double portion compared to the other children. So he had to sell a third of his estate, give the money to the son. And we know the story. So the son takes his share and goes off. And he squanders everything he's been given. And he's come to the point where he's completely impoverished. And he's been taken advantage of, and his life is in complete and absolute ruins. And when he's literally in the pigsty, literally in the mud, he comes to realize how fool he had been. And he comes up with a plan, with an idea. So the first part of the plan is to go home, and that's what he says in the text. He says, "In my father's house there's bread to spare, and I'm starving here. I will go, and I will confess to my father, but I'll go home. I need to do that." This is simple and yet very profound. Home here is not a dwelling place alone. It's not a place where we live. It's not a physical site. It has a deep psychological and emotional meaning here. Home is the place where you are who you are. And you are accepted by who you are. You don't have to impress anyone. You don't have to wear any social mask. You are who you are. Limitations, virtues, limit and shortcomings, but you are accepted authentically. So this deep meaning and a very central key word in this text. So that's what he actually longed for. And he came up with a plan and say, well, I have to have something special. He's longing for relationship, for deep understanding, for acceptance, despite all the errors. So he basically said, well, how can I reapproach my father? And that's the second part of his plan, as the text says. I will go to my father, and I will say to him, I am not worthy to be called your son. So make me like Happy Sabbath. This is not a request, for example, to be a slave. Pleased. And the situation was even worse than a slave. Slave belonged to the master. They're like part of the patrimony. They live in the state. No, I want to be a hired man. So essentially, a hired worker lived in the town and had a salary, had a wage. So what actually he's saying, therefore, is that he wants to pay the father back. He knows that he simply cannot back to the community whose morals he had violated by a simple apology. He has to make reinstate something. There has to be a restitution or some form of paying back. And that's his notion, that's the idea. So he's coming to his father and say, well, I don't want to be reinstated as your son. I don't want, and I do not deserve it. I don't deserve the status of sonship. I want to earn my way back. Make me like one of your employees, like your hired man. I want to pay you back, and that's the plan. And with this in mind, rehearsing his speech, he goes back to his house. And the Bible says that the father, to put the father as a prominent feature, the first one, the father sees him, see the son coming from the distance. Now, put yourself in the father's place. Now, if you are the father and you see your adult son coming, and that's your same son, the same guy who harmed your family, the family name, squandered a lot of your wealth, how would you react? What would you do? The Bible tells us, interestingly, that the father had compassion of him. And what does he do? What does the text say? Physically, how does he respond to that? He runs. That's what he does. And become a very beautiful scene, a wonderful scene, the father running towards the son. It's incredible. But it would be even more incredible if we know that patriarchs never ran. Never. According to the code of conduct, there's a profound humiliation of someone of higher status to be running in public. Slaves run, young run, children run, but not a senior, but not a patriarch. And that's exactly what he does. He doesn't think much about it. So profound is a response to the presence, to the physical presence of his son. That's how he responds. He runs. And very, very interesting, the other important thing is to think about the environment, where he is, the design of the state. Think about where I am is where the father's house is. There's a central corridor, a link, an avenue to the gate, and the house is in both sides, and the back is the agriculture. So looking at the son, not only for joy, for happiness of running and reaching him, but also for a very important reason. He was protecting his son. The people who live and work in the farm would see the son, and that's the boy, that's the guy who dishonored my master. They were entitled to punish him physically, to kick him out. So he did it to protect him. No, nobody touches my son. I'll be the first one. I'll greet him. Nobody comes first. So that's a very, very important thing. And there's another interesting thing here in verse 20. The father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And this sequence is important because there's a very deep body language here. So he ran, embraced the son, and kissed him. We know that even nowadays, Middle Eastern men, when they meet, they salute, they greet each other, kissing on the face. But they only do that if they have the same status, the same social status. If when you meet a friend, for example, when a person of higher status meets someone of a lower status, the one of lower status has to kiss the hand of the higher one. And by doing that, it does a body language showing that you are the same. We still keep the same kind of relationship. For me, you are the same son that left the other day. So that's interesting. And he tries to react to that with his rehearsed speech to the father, was in verse 21. They say, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." This is immediately interrupted by the father who says, who ordains, in fact, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet." And this is also very significant. The robe and the ring are they're not here merely for a simple response, for clothing him up. No. They're signs of authority. When we remember the story of Jacob and Joseph and why Joseph received the beautiful robe and all the brothers get jealous and angry with that, no, Reuben should have deserved that. It was an indication of favoritism by Jacob towards Joseph, and only the possibility of making one of the youngest ones the future leader. It was a sign of authority. And a ring is not a common ring. It's a signet ring. People in those days did not sign a contract by signing a piece of something. They basically used the family ring as a sign of authority. You sign a contract, but wax or something, and indenting with a ring. So basically what the language of the Bible is saying here, that he has recovered completely, 100%, his status as son out of the blue by sheer grace. And that's the beauty that most people see. But most people only focus on this first part of the story. They don't pay attention to the continuity and the radical message Jesus is about to share. Jesus' goal, his purpose in telling this parable was not to give us a sentimental image that somehow God will accept us no matter what we have done. He was basically saying to the Pharisees, you need to contextualize and remember that he was talking to the Pharisees, and say, everything you understand about God and about yourself might be wrong. We're significantly limited. So the story continues. So you see there's another character that we haven't met yet, and that's the elder brother. He hasn't learned the lesson about the return of his brother. So what does the father do? As we read in the text, he throws a magnificent feast. The older son was working. That's what he does, was in the field. So he came near the house, and he heard music and heard celebration. He said, well, what's going on? So he called a servant and asked him, what's happening here? And the servant replied, your brother has come home, and your father has killed a fattened calf for him. And how did he react to that? He was absolutely furious. He was so angry that he refused to go in and join the feast. So by saying that, it was his turn to assault the integrity of the family. He was saying, by not going in, say, I will not be part of the family. I'm the heir. And I won't be in the same family with this guy in it. So that situation forced the father to come out and plead with the elder brother. But it does not respond, it does not react the way he expected. He won't come. He's even abrasive to his father. He says, look, he doesn't even call him father. He says, look, all these years, what he's been doing, I've been good. I never disobeyed you. And when this son of yours, who squandered a lot of your property, you come and kill the fattened calf for him. That's completely unfair. So how come you can do that? I'm not going to join this. Not even call him my brother. Says your son. He detaches the connection with his biological son, biological brother. So he calls him the son of yours and reminds him of everything that he did. He's particularly furious. Why is he so angry? Why is he so upset to the point of reacting to like that? So start with the fattened calf. He was furious about the cost of his brother coming back home. So that's the reason why he's so angry. Think about the fattened calf first. In those days, people did not used to eat meat. Meat was very, very expensive. It was a great delicacy. But the most expensive delicacy of all was the fattened calf. So it's not a kind of thing that you even do in a private type of event, a private party. So when the fattened calf was killed, it meant that the entire community would join the feast of family. It's like the most important day of his father's life. Oh, that's the occasion. That's when we have to celebrate and kill the fattened calf. And it tells a lot. I say, why do you do that? Why not only a goat or something more simple? Why you start literally dismantling the patrimony that one day will be mine? He's absolutely furious with that. And incredibly, the father went out to plead with the elder brother, saying, my son, you are always with me, and something important. Everything that I have is yours. And this is literally true. Because when you remember, when he divided the property between them, the son, younger son took his share, and I was gone. Every single thing that the father owns, everything, the elder brothers will inherit. So here's in the climax of the story, when you're expecting to see how the older brother will react, how will he respond, Jesus simply ends the parable. He never tells us the end. It stops like that. But why? What is Jesus trying to get across? It's very clear that both major characters, the two brothers, must be compared and contrasted. So we need to remember to whom Jesus was telling this parable. It was the Pharisees. These guys were very upset by the attention and the love Jesus was dispensing to those sinners. These two groups are the ones represented in the parable. So obviously for us, with our own human sense of justice, not God's sense of justice, we recognize some patterns very, very easily. So when we see the first one, we see the younger brother, we see the very traditional depiction of sin. Someone insulting the father, someone who's dissolute, licentious, self-indulgent. Yeah, that's obviously the weird pattern for our Judeo-Christian ethic and way of seeing the world. But when we look at the second part of the story, when Jesus had completely turned the tables, that's what we have. We have two sons, one good and the other one bad, and both of them alienated from the Father. And that's the key element of the message. then we come to realize that both of them want exactly the same thing. Neither want the Father, but they want the same goal. The Father is just a means for an identical end, the same goal. The difference is the pathway. What do you do to obtain that? One does by cutting immediately relationship with the Father, exploring what he thinks he's entitled to have, goes off. The other one does things obeying, by obedience. So that's why we can clearly see the denounced behavior and the reason why he does that. So when we look at him, we see, why does the elder brother not go into the feast, not join the feast, join the banquet? He tells you. He says, I never disobeyed you, Father. That's the reason why I'm not going to the feast. So in other words, what's keeping him away from the Father is not his sin, but his self-righteousness. And that's an extremely important point. Very, very important point. So both of them are trying to get control of the things of the Father by keeping all the rules. But my goal is not that. It's like us. We think that God, okay, I have to come to church, I have to return the tithes and offerings, but my goal is the blessings, not the presence of God. So it's like an ATM machine. So there's the ATM machine, that's where you get the money from. So that's it. So you don't understand that the essence is the relationship with the Father. All the other things are secondary, or derivative from that. You need to understand that. And trying to behave in such a way in order to obtain merit or reward, that's not Christianity. It has never been Christianity. We are deeply influenced by many of the forms of religiosity and natural religions. If you look at Judaism, and look at Islam, for example, if you do a lot of things correctly, you will deserve heaven or Jannah. If you pray in such a way, if you do this and this, you don't understand the key message. So Jesus comes to revolutionize everything. Everything you do has to be an outcome for the quality of relationship with your Father. And this relationship will transform you. And the fruits derivative from this relationship, this is what counts. Not your own initiative to pursue salvation on your own. So that's a very deep message that Jesus is conveying to the Pharisees. And you need to understand this. Something extremely, extremely important. So Jesus now, when we think, okay, he was addressing the Pharisees, but does this apply to me? Of course it does. So when we think, when we realize that Jesus wants us to see ourselves in the story, like in a participatory theater. He wants us to see that we need something which is missing in our lives. He wants us to long for something. He wants us to hope for home. And something of very, very deep meaning here, as just mentioned a few minutes ago. When you think about home, there's a sense that C.S. Lewis beautifully put in one of his writings, say we long for something, we don't know what it is. And there's water for thirst, food for hunger. Our search has a response. It's not here. It's not in this world. And that's what we actually long. Until we find God, we are restless. Oh, I have to change the job, I'll be happier.